Alex here with part 16 of the Respondent. Before I even go into this video, I would like to mention that apparently um, Greg Ellis was interviewed. I think it was on Jordan Peterson's show. That like Jordan Peterson has a channel on YouTube, and you should be able to find the Greg Ellis video, the interview with Jordan Peterson on his channel. I very strongly recommend watching that video. If you have read the book, it's going to give you some insight into Greg Ellis's evolution, both as a public figure and, um, I guess, with maybe you could consider sort of updated or more current perspectives on his experience because his book was written some time ago, and also if you haven't read the book and you just want to sort of skip that, save a bunch of time, and at least get maybe 20-30% of what was in the book, I would recommend watching the interview for that reason as well. It really improved my perspective of Greg Ellis, especially after he posted his comments on my videos reviewing his book. He left a very poor impression. But having seen Jordan Peterson confront him, and how Greg Ellis responded when confronted, especially towards the middle and end of the interview, it seems to me that he's learning how to deal with other people's perspectives and other people's questions. He wasn't defensive, I don't think, much, if at all. And I think that probably this chapter is the best time to bring up the interview and the more positive light that I think it leaves Greg Ellis in. Also, I noticed that Jordan Peterson seemed to criticize the shift from fault divorce to no fault divorce as well, which kind of changes my perspective because at the time, I think it was chapter 15, the last video, it came off very badly. And what I mean by that is the denunciation of no fault divorce and sort of this argument that people need to go back to fault divorces came off very badly. It always has come off very badly for me. And I have honestly seen it as the most extreme form of control. But having seen Jordan Peterson question Greg Ellis on it, I noticed that it didn't jump out to Mr. Peterson as obvious as it did to me. And it makes me think maybe there's sort of the opt-out mentality approach to why people are arguing for that and not so much the control approach. I do have a video on opt-out mentality. I brought that up when it came to things like sovereign citizens, and it was me trying to sort of understand that they really were just trying to find a way to opt out of the system because they didn't trust it. And if that's why some people are arguing for bringing back fault divorce, then I can understand that. I still vehemently disagree, and it would make high conflict child custody and high conflict divorce even worse. I'm 100% do not agree with that approach, but I can at least understand that maybe it's not just a control sort of argument. Maybe it's just people trying to find a way to opt out, and they think that if you bring back for fault divorce, then you can sort of block the divorce from even starting. I'm going to reiterate one more time that this is a terrible idea, but I no longer feel like it discredits Greg Ellis's entire book that he took that position. Seeing Jordan Peterson sort of consider it made me think that it's probably one of those highly counterintuitive issues, of which there are many in high conflict child custody cases, for example, right of first refusal. Anyway, now I'll go into chapter 16. I think that chapter 16, I'm going to go ahead and summarize very quickly, is probably Greg Ellis's best chapter. In the beginning, I think that he mostly failed in trying to get the reader to understand his position, to understand his perspective, to relate to him. But in chapter 16, he does all of those things. And so it's probably not good that it takes this far into the book to really understand Greg Ellis's position and his perspective, but it does at least occur, and it changes my mind about him. A lot of the things that he mentions in chapter 16 changes my mind from mostly negative to mostly positive. I still see flaws in his thinking and his approach, but I can understand them now, whereas before I couldn't. Um, he talks about DCFS's involvement in his case, more specifically the questioning, what he calls interrogation, which I agree with, of his children. He talks about CPS investigation tactics. Specifically, he talks about leading questions. And I've heard of this. I believe it. CPS, as far as I know, is not trained on the sort of restraints that police have to concern themselves with, boundaries that police have to concern themselves with. My understanding is that if CPS crosses those boundaries, you're not going to see suppression. I mean, if I'm wrong, please correct me. But there are certain things that police cannot do, or the interrogation / interview can get suppressed. And as far as I know, CPS doesn't have to worry about those things. And I have heard many people say that they, not always, but in some situations, will ask the children leading questions to get them down a path that they want, to go, so that they can prosecute the case. So when he says that the investigation was appalling and unethical and immoral, and that there were leading questions and all that, I'm inclined to believe it. He also talks about a psychiatric evaluation or psychological evaluation that he was subjected to, and how it involved an objective personality test, and that there were in-depth findings of not only him, but I guess other persons involved in the case, including the monitor. He says that this report exonerated him and actually damaged his ex's credibility. He says that the report cited his ex's failure to facilitate the relationship between the children and he. I'm inclined to believe it. It would be nice to see it, but of course, this type of stuff is, for the most part, kept confidential. And the only reason I say that is because in these cases, a lot of times people question whether or not they're being told the truth. I said earlier I'm inclined to believe it, and I am, especially because of the detail that he goes into, which I'm not going to bother with the summary. You can read the book if you want to get the details that he goes into with regards to this report. The children apparently, I guess this is something that was mentioned in the report, had mentioned something about his ex wanting to kill him. The children, the report also, I guess, contemplated parental alienation and malicious mother syndrome. I'm not sure if Greg Ellis is drawing his own conclusions there, or if it's the actual, if it's in the actual report itself. I talk about parental alienation on this channel a lot. I'm not going to go into it again with this chapter, but for me, it's not so much the conclusion of what's having occurred in the end, so much as the abuse that the parent has committed to get there. With a lot of people, in fact, I'd say with most people, they just say, hey, look, my kid doesn't want to hang out with me anymore, therefore I've been alienated. And I completely disagree with that approach. But if you guys want to learn more about that, you can watch my videos on the topic. He talks about how the children were in fear of his ex and that they wanted to live with him. And later he talks about how Judge Iwasaki dismissed the report. Now, I'm not sure if this is exactly what happened, because he later mentions that the judge, he calls the judge a kick-the-can judge. It is true that a lot of family court judges stall and delay and continue, but it could possibly be that the report was brought up during a non-evidentiary hearing, and that Judge Iwasaki wanted to wait until an evidentiary hearing to consider it. Now, I'm speculating because Greg Ellis hasn't put together a My Docket series, so we don't have a sort of beginning to end comprehensive way to follow his case, both the filings and the hearings. If we did have those things, then we could actually determine whether or not this occurred in a way that constitutes malfeasance. But it is entirely possible that Judge Iwasaki said, I'm going to just wait till we can hold a bench trial or some other evidentiary hearing, and at that point I'll consider it. And Greg Ellis's perspective on that might just be if the judge didn't want to consider evidence because he was incompetent. For all we know, that's what happened, but we just don't know. The restraining order, he says, was used as a threat in the actual courthouse. Now, this I find very plausible as well. I am inclined to believe this. In fact, it happened to me once, where I had to bring my ex into court for a debtor's exam, and she caused a huge scene, and the restraining order that she was talking about wasn't even in effect anymore. It was, not only was it expired, but it was like years old, and she just wanted to make a scene because she could. And I remember it actually pissing off the it wasn't the judge, it was the judge's clerk or the judge's JEA or something. She stormed out of the courtroom to go and get, I'm calling him a judge. It was Discovery Commissioner Wes Ayers. And this is, I don't have the actual video footage of it, but I do talk about this in my docket series. So this is not the first time I'm bringing this up. But yeah, apparently there was some histrionics there. And I'm inclined to believe that occurred. And that's a yellow/red flag of her being the high conflict party, his ex. So he talks about, I like this part. I really like this part. I guess he goes to lunch across the street from the courthouse or somewhere close to the courthouse, and there are people that he eavesdrops talking about his case. And he says that they were staff, either department staff or in some other way connected to the case. And he mentions not only that they were gossiping about the details of his case, but specifically that they laughed that he wouldn't be able to get the DCFS reports because they were sealed, and that was funny to them. I'm inclined to believe this as well. I've heard staff gossip about cases that are in their departments. I've heard court personnel that, one of the things that kind of makes me chuckle is a lot of the there's this sort of overarching general perspective within the family bench bar that these cases need to be confidential and private. And most of the people who gossip and talk about the cases are the department staff themselves. It's the court personnel. And I wonder if the judges know that. They probably do and don't care. And it's just probably because they can't do anything about it. So it's a little, I guess, hypocritical for them to want to protect the information with regards to these cases from going into the public eye while they themselves joke about it. I'm inclined to believe it because I've seen it before. And that's not so much with my TPP capacity as it is with my Arnavadic judge's capacity. Let's see. He talks about how, I have to be careful about this because I don't really know the background, and I don't know if it's true or not, and it's potentially going to be an issue. So I guess his ex's attorney, her last name is Bogan, so Ms. Bogan, he says that she either got kicked out of the firm or left the firm or resigned from the firm or was forced to resign from the firm. I'm not going to go into the specifics because to me that part isn't as important as the next part, which is that apparently she billed his ex for over $1 million and that she sued or was pursuing his ex for an additional $400,000. And he was amused, Greg Ellis was amused that his ex's attorney had turned on her because the sort of thought process was that all of the things that she had done to him, she was now going to do it to his ex and that she deserved it. I mean, this is typically true when it comes to unscrupulous attorneys, and I'm not saying she's unscrupulous, but I'm saying let's take it for granted that she is. If a high conflict ex hires an unscrupulous attorney, which they usually do, because the scrupulous ones won't do what they want, eventually there's usually a situation like this where the lawyer turns on the client and all of the manipulation and abusive litigation practices they had used against their client's opponent, now they're using against their own client. So this is something that I like that he highlighted. He talks about it at length in the chapter. I do recommend. This is one of the many reasons I recommend a read of chapter 16. So his ex loses that lawyer, gets a new lawyer, and they object to the psychological evaluation that he was subjected to. They want another one. If I remember correctly, it took 4 years to get another one, conducted or something like that. That particular detail is not as important to me so much as the next detail, which is that he calls it a carbon copy. He says that the second evaluation was a carbon copy of the first, and that it was basically a stall tactic. That's what I'm getting. And I talk about this in my video, Delay Tactics. It's one of the more extreme versions of a delay tactic because you basically convince the court to do the same exact thing that they've already done, which is going to trigger massive delays and expenses. He also talks about how after he got the results of the second evaluation, how his ex's attorney objected to the court just taking it and considering it just based on the report, that they wanted to invoke hearsay and force the expert to appear in open court and testify on it, which was, so he says the second report was an additional $7,500 and that the expert coming into court to testify was an additional $4,500 per day. So that's, I find that to be highly plausible. I find it, it's probably true. It would be nice to read it again, guys, but we don't have it. And I've heard this stuff happening before, though. This is not like this is not an outlandish statement. This is something that I've heard, happens, and it's horrible. So we have the Next thing that he goes into is anger. He talks about how media peddles anger for cash. He talks about how he has a different perspective of anger. He has a healthy, natural anger, clean anger, what he calls. And then he also has, he concedes that there are toxic or negative versions of anger as well. I love that he goes into this because I completely agree with what he's talking about here. He says that people should learn to hear what their anger has to tell them. I completely agree with this. I mean, there's a difference between anger and hate. There is. And anger could stem from outrage. It could lead to corrections. It could lead to the denunciation of things that are justifiably wrong. And I'm not going to go ahead and just reiterate what he said. I think it's yet another reason why chapter 16 was a chapter that I could relate to, and it helped me understand him. And I think that chapter 16 is probably the chapter that's going to leave the most positive of impressions on his readers. And he also talks a little bit about some philosophical stuff about the natural state of being change, about how attachment is bad. He goes into, I guess, Buddhist principles. Talks about becoming less emotionally dependent. He talks about the emotional neglect that he was subjected to. He talks about how his childhood made him more susceptible to dysfunctional understandings of love. He talks about love in the general sense and specifically some examples of what he learned. He talks about how he was devoid of self-worth because of his parents. He talks about how he was addicted to a toxic version of love. I mean, a lot of this just reminds me of my video on the topic self-love deficit disorder. He talks about how it caused him to always search for the next high. It made him ashamed of himself, how he loathed his own self. All of this stuff, yet another reason why chapter 16 is helpful to understand Greg Ellis. And I'm not going to say he's not a weird individual, but some of the most remarkable people on this planet are weird. And you're looking at a guy who founded our Nevada judges, so I'm just like, obviously weird. So yes, this is the first time that I could relate to and understand Greg Ellis. Chapter 16 was a very important chapter, and for all the reasons that I mentioned, not only in my analysis of this chapter, but in my summary at the beginning, I strongly recommend that you guys watch the Jordan Peterson interview with Greg Ellis. So I think that's all I have for chapter 16. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post them down in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time.